My name is Mike West. I work at Google, as I just said. I work in the Chrome privacy team. That's based in Germany because Germans have really interesting opinions about privacy. And we figure if we can make it right here, we can make it right pretty much everywhere. I work not only on privacy, but also on some security stuff on the side. I very actively participate in the W3C's Web Application Security Working Group. And I edit 2 specifications that I want to talk with you guys about today. You can find me on Twitter, you can find me on Google+. Twitter is probably the best place to actually get answers to questions because I find that 140 characters is kind of a reasonable investment to make in an answer. Anything more than that, I'm going to have to actually start thinking about it, and you might or might not actually get an answer to your question. But on Twitter, I'm relatively responsive, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have either about this presentation or about anything else. If you want to run ahead of me, you can download the slides right now. They're on Speaker Deck. So none of you have laptops. This is the first time I've ever been in a talk anywhere, where people didn't have their laptops out. This is beautiful. It does mean, however, that you're going to have to write down URLs. And I've tried to make the URLs short, but there are a couple that I think are really important and that I'd like you to see later. So think about that. So I work in the Munich office. I really like this logo, so I like giving it its own slide. The marketing team in Hamburg decided putting a little Bavarian hat on the Chrome logo would be a funny idea, and it really was. So, university, culture. Do any of you know what this painting is, or what it depicts? Culture, university. This is not a liberal arts school, is it? Yeah.
It's about Odysseus and the Sirens.
Yeah, exactly, Odysseus and the Sirens. And this is a really interesting story, and it's one that I think has surprisingly real impact on the way that I think about web security. So the story goes something like this. The sirens sing beautifully. So beautifully, in fact, that they drive men to the brink of madness, especially sailors. They really like sailors for some reason. Probably because sailors have boats and therefore can get to their island where they live. So as sailors sail past the island, the sirens sing, they drive the sailors to the brink of madness, they jump overboard just to hear more of the music, they get closer to the music. And jumping overboard is a terrible, terrible way to steer a ship. So the ship crashes into the island and the sirens, I guess they eat people or something, who knows. They get something good out of it. Regardless, Odysseus, being the amazing man that he is, decides that he wants to be the only person alive to have heard the song of the sirens, but survived, but not to have been driven mad, not to have thrown himself overboard. He talks to the witch and comes up with a really great plan. And the plan is something like this. He tells his men to put beeswax in their ears, and then to bind things around their head as kind of primitive earmuffs, so they can't actually hear any of the siren's song. Then they're free to follow the rest of his instructions, which are, first, tie him to the mast. Tie him tightly so that he can't actually get away from the mast, that he can't really do anything other than be tied to a mast. Then they are to sail past the island where the sirens are. They're just to keep rowing, keep going in a straight line. Don't go to the island, just go past it. And if you see any sirens floating around, just kind of ignore them, keep rowing. This plan works wonderfully. The sailors can't hear the song of the sirens, so they continue past the island without being driven mad. Odysseus, of course, is driven to the brink of madness, but he doesn't throw himself overboard. Not because he doesn't want to, of course, but because he's physically prevented himself from doing so. He can't do anything, remember. He's tied to a mast. He's removed the possibilities from himself that he knows in his moments of sanity could do him harm. He's locked himself down so that he can only do the one thing that he wants to do, which is listen to the song of the sirens, enjoy the song of the sirens, but not be driven to the point where he does harm to himself because of the song of the sirens. I think the metaphor here is relatively clear. It would be wonderful if your application could in some way instruct the browser to do good things, but not to do bad things. Your application knows the extent of what the application actually needs in order to do the things that the application does. It knows what resources it needs to load. It knows what resources it needs to execute on the page in order to do something useful for your users. It'd be great if the application could in some way instruct the browser, do these things, but don't do these things. I know you really want to execute this JavaScript, but just ignore it for a little while. It's not going to be good for the application. This really boils down, I think, to the principle of least privilege, which is, I think, bedrock for security. You want to give your applications and the users in your application the minimum amount of privilege necessary in order to do the things that they need to do, in order to do their jobs. But don't give them privileges that they don't actually need. For instance, there's really no reason at all that a normal user should need direct access to your database. So you don't give them your database password. If you do give them your database password, you're doing yourself harm. So removing possibilities from your users and removing possibilities from the user agent is only going to be good for your application. It's going to ensure that your application does the things that your application needs to do, but doesn't even have the potential of doing the things it can't do. So what I'd like to talk with you about today are a couple of privileges that I think we should reconsider. Privileges that are granted to applications just by virtue of the openness of the web. I think if we were to go back to the beginning when the web was actually designed, we would recognize that security was not at all a concern that people had. This was universities talking to universities, sharing information as widely and as openly as possible. This led to some design decisions that made sense in that context and continued to make sense in the context of spreading information, but start making less sense when we want to hold on to information and when we want to have safe bastions where users can log in, do some work, or do sensitive things like banking while not leaking that information to third parties. So 3 things that I'd like us to reconsider. First, we should never load content over unencrypted connections. Browsers are perfectly happy to do this. If you type in http example.com, it'll be happy to load that over an unencrypted connection. I think that's a bad idea, and I think we should reconsider that. And I think your application should be able to tell the browser in some way that this is in fact not what you want. Second, browsers currently will accept anything that lives at a URL as being the thing that should live at that URL. This makes man-in-the-middle attacks possible, because if I can simply replace the content at a URL with something else, with something malicious, the browser has no mechanism by which it can determine that that thing was accurate or was intact or was corrupted. I think we should be able to tell the browser in some way that this thing that I'm loading is in fact this piece of information. And if it's not that information, then please don't execute it. We'll talk about that in a moment. And third, browsers will currently load any content that a page tells them to. So if I go to a page that has a lot of script tags in it and a lot of image tags in it, all of those will be loaded by the browser just as quickly as the browser can possibly load them. I think we should reconsider this as well. I think the application should, again, have a mechanism by which it can tell the browser that these resources are good resources. These are the parts of my application that I think are important. And anything beyond that should be locked down in some way so that the browser won't actually load those things that the application doesn't need and didn't actually want to request. So first and foremost, never load unencrypted content. If you don't do this, if you have an application and the application is serving data over an unencrypted connection, then stop listening right now. Go home and change the application. Because if you don't do this, then everything else that I'm talking about is completely worthless. If you're not serving your content over an encrypted authenticated connection, then you have no security, period. You are completely open, and you're going to be in a really bad position. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. We conceive of the internet like this. I have my laptop, and there's a data center out there somewhere. I make a request to the data center. I say, please, Mr. Data Center, give me example.com. The data center does some work and then gives me back a wonderful web page that's rendered in my browser, and everyone's happy. We know, of course, that this isn't actually how the web works. In fact, I make a request, and that request hops and hops and hops between a wide variety of servers and routers and a number of other machines out there on the web until it gets to the endpoint. And then the response does the same. It might even take a completely different route back to me than the one that it took to the server. I need to trust each and every one of those points in between me and the thing that I actually want to talk to take my request and deliver it intact, and at the same time take the response and deliver that intact. But instead, I go to universities, or I go to coffee shops, and I connect to their Wi-Fi networks, or I connect to their wired networks. And I don't really want to have to trust that the middlemen, the people in between me and that server, are doing the right thing with my data, meaning just passing it through without modification. In fact, we see lots of interesting cases where the data can be modified on the fly quite trivially when it's being served over an HTTP connection as opposed to HTTPS. So I make a connection, but as soon as I make that connection, it's already been modified maliciously, or it's coming back in a malicious way. Encryption gives you a mechanism of solving this. It's not a great mechanism. As we've seen last week and the week before and the week before that, there are a wide variety of problems with TLS. But TLS is absolutely all that we have when we're looking at encrypting anything wide scale on the net. Given that, even with the problems of TLS, even with the problems that come with the certificate authorities and a variety of others, it's still well worth your time to go out, get a certificate, and encrypt the data that you're sending and the data that's being received. It's the only mechanism that gives your users any protection whatsoever and any guarantee that they're actually talking to you and not talking to someone posing as you. Once you've gone out and gotten the certificate, there are a couple of additional things you need to do. First, you need to ensure that cookies are only sent over a secured connection. If you don't actually tell the browser this is a secure cookie, then the browser is happy to send that cookie to any connection to this endpoint, regardless of whether it's secure or not. You need to be really, really careful when you're talking to the browser and explain in great detail, look, this is secure, it's kind of important, please only send this over HTTPS and not over HTTP. You do this very simply by adding a secure attribute to the cookie. So just in the cookie string, you type secure and everyone's happy. While you're there, if you're screwing with this line anyway, just add HTTP only, because you very, very rarely actually need to touch the cookie from JavaScript. In fact, I'd say that if you are touching the cookie from JavaScript, you're probably doing it wrong. I think what you need to do instead is leave cookies and leave state to the server. Now, there are certainly times where that's not true and that you really, really need to touch cookies via JavaScript. And in that case, you're kind of on your own. I'm recommending against it. What you then need to do, once you've said that the cookies are only sent over a secure connection, is ensure that the website itself is only ever sent over a secure connection. Now, of course, you're going to set up a redirect. So if I type in http.example.com, that there will be a permanent redirect from example.com on HTTP to example.com on HTTPS. This ensures that your users actually get to the HTTPS site at some point in the future. But it's relatively straightforward for an active network attacker sitting between you and that server to strip the HTTP redirection, or to take that connection and actually deliver content back to you over HTTP, pretending that the website is actually existing over HTTP. What you need to do is instruct the browser to actually never load this origin or never load this website over an unencrypted connection. You do this by setting strict transport security. And this is a very straightforward header. You say strict transport security with a max age of a year or however long. And for that period of time, the browser will do redirects locally. It won't make an initial HTTP connection, even if I type in http://example.com. If I type in http://example.com, the browser will look at the list of strict transport security that it has locally and say, this origin is requested that it only be served over HTTPS, so I'm going to redirect locally. I'm only going to make the HTTPS request. I'm going to skip the HTTP request entirely. This is a really, really good thing, because it ensures that no matter how the attacker tries to trick your user into going to HTTP, the browser will actually stop them from doing so. It is, of course, possible that even when doing this, even when ensuring that you're only being served over an HTTPS connection, that there are still mechanisms by which parties can trick you into believing that you're talking to a server that you're not actually talking to. So if a certificate authority can be convinced in one way or another to give out a certificate for Google.com that Google.com didn't actually request, then it's quite possible for any server to pretend to be Google.com. We see this happening much more than we would like to. The protection against this is to pin a certificate for your domain. The idea of pinning is basically this. I take a hash of the public key that I used to sign the certificate, and I attach that hash to the response as an HTTP header. The browser can then say, OK, all of the requests that are coming from this server have to have a certificate that matches this hash, or whose public key matches this hash. And you can do this in a couple of ways. You can either use your public key, or you can use the public key of one of the certificate authorities in the chain, all the way up to the root. It's most secure to use your own public key, because you can verify that only certificates that you have actually signed for are considered valid for your site. What's really nice about this, in combination with strict transport security, is that any cert that doesn't match this hash will be considered a certificate error in exactly the same way as a bad certificate or a self-signed certificate. And because you've requested strict transport security, the browser won't actually give you the option of proceeding. So you've all seen these certificate error pages where it says, hey, this is a bad certificate. And you say, screw that, and you click proceed and just go to the website because you want to get these cute cat pictures, right? These are the most important things to you at the moment. And screw SSL errors, I want my cat pictures. Strict transport security will ensure that the users aren't actually given that option. You've requested strict verification of your certificates. And if you pin that cert, and the cert that's presented doesn't actually match that pin, we'll block the request to the site, and users will be protected. They'll be kind of annoyed because they won't be able to get to their site, but they'll be annoyed for a good reason. And that reason is that they're potentially being attacked. So, some people say that the cost of certificates is problematic, and they don't want to buy a certificate. And I completely understand, because certs are trivial to produce. You shouldn't have to pay hundreds of euro to get a certificate. As it turns out, you don't have to pay hundreds of euro to get a certificate. Start SSL is a relatively small CA that gives out free certificates for non-commercial use. So if you have a personal website, you go to Start SSL, get a free certificate for your website, and start encrypting things. It's really good. This is what I use for my website. They have another level where you can say, I don't know, pay, I think, $60. Yeah, $60 to get verified as an individual. And at that point, you can start using it for commercial purposes, and you get wildcards and a variety of other things. But if you just want to secure a small application, the cost is not a factor, or should not be a factor in your determination. If you want an EV certificate, if you want this nice little green bar that does absolutely nothing, then feel free to pay more for that. But the encryption you get is going to be exactly the same as a DV certificate, as a domain verification. So generally speaking, I would recommend that people go to Start SSL. If you want to pay more, you absolutely can, but free is a relatively good price. Once you've gone out and gotten the certificate and installed it in your application and made sure that you're sending users to that secure site, make sure you're doing it right. There's a really good website called SSL Labs. I'm sorry, SSL Test, which is part of SSL Labs. And this will allow you to verify that you've configured SSL correctly for your website. It's a really, really easy tool to use. You just type in your domain, hit a button, and then wait about a minute. And it does a wide variety of tests, gives you a lot of good information about the way that you've configured your website, and will help you figure out what things you need to do in order to make your website more secure than it currently is. So it'll help you pick the right ciphers. It'll tell you when you pick ciphers that are bad. It'll tell you if you're allowing SSL3, which you shouldn't, and a wide variety of other things. Just recently, of course, they added a test for Heartbleed, which actually works. This was one of the very few Heartbleed tests that did not have false positives or false negatives. It actually did the right thing the way that it was supposed to. So if you want to test a website for Heartbleed, this is also a good way to do it. And it'll give you a relatively accurate answer. So with that in mind as bedrock, we can start looking at some of these other things that we'd like the browser not to do on our behalf. One of those things is trusting URLs. Now, URLs are awesome. URLs are the core of the web, and I think probably the thing that makes the web the most successful information distribution platform on the planet. Because things have URLs, because things are named in a way that can be shared and a way that can be linked to, we have the ability to share information in a way that we've never had before. And this is really important for actual resources. It's very important for things that humans are going to read, to have URLs that are in fact meaningful, and to have the URL be the canonical identification of this resource. For things that humans don't see, however, it's a bit problematic to have the URL be the thing. For example, if I have a website and I have a lot of customers in countries where I am not. So for instance, I'm in Europe, but I have customers or users that come from Australia. The speed of light starts becoming a limiting factor in the speed at which I can get them information. There's going to be a lag on their, a latency with their requests and my responses just because I am not physically close to them. So I start using content delivery networks. And the content delivery network might look like this: CDN, example.net, script.js. So I have basically given authority to the CDN to run script on my website. I have probably a contractual agreement with them in some way that says, I will upload this file and you will serve that file to these people. And contractual agreements are great. I'm all for them. But I think it's really good to both trust and verify, and to make sure that the CDN is in fact delivering the resource that you expect it to. Because if I have this tag on my website, I am giving example.net the ability to run script on my website in exactly the same way that I do when I embed any third-party widget. that sort of ambient authority is easy to abuse. It can be either abused by malicious parties within the CDN itself or within whatever server it is that I'm trusting. It can be abused by attackers who gain access to something like Akamai. These CDNs, especially the really large ones, are very, very tempting targets because they have authority to execute script in the context of a wide variety of websites. We think we should do something about this. So there's a new spec that's been put out called Sub-Resource Integrity that I edit along with Freddie from Mozilla, Dev, and also Joel from Google. And the idea is very, very simple. It's something that's been talked about for years and years and years. We're just now in the process of actually putting it down on paper in the hopes that we can implement it. And the idea is this. You have a hash associated with the entity or with the resource. And you say, OK, I'm loading a resource from this URL. Please, browser, verify that this resource actually matches this hash. It's relatively straightforward. Right now, we're supporting SHA-256 or SHA-512. And you grab the resource, you hash it, and then you see if it matches. And if it does, wonderful, you load the resource. If it doesn't, then something has gone wrong. And you want to reject that resource because it's not actually what the author intended to be loaded. What the author intended matches the hash. And what the author didn't intend doesn't. Now, what's really interesting about this is that it opens up some interesting discussion points. For instance, if I don't need the URL anymore, if the URL doesn't actually identify the content, but instead I have a hash that really is the same as the content, because the idea of the hash is that it's unique, then why do I need the URL in the first place? Can't I just use the hash to cache the resource and say, I want to load this hash. Please give me this hash. Please give me the data that's associated with this hash. That's pretty interesting, and I think it would be really useful for browsers to be able to do. I don't want to load jQuery 40 times if I go to 40 different websites. It's the same library. I should be able to load it once and then have the browser say, oh yeah, you want this thing that I've already downloaded. I just downloaded it at a different URL. So a content addressable cache is, I think, a nice byproduct of the security that you would get by having an integrity hash or integrity metadata along with the resource. It opens up some interesting questions, however. For instance, if I have a content addressable cache, it becomes potentially easier for attackers to determine what things I've downloaded before. They would just be able to put a hash into a page, and if it loads immediately, well, then I probably had that. And if it doesn't load immediately, then I probably didn't. And this would bypass things like, or it would be problematic in terms of things like CORS, which is origin-based, where you send CORS header. Does anyone know what CORS is? Does anyone not know what CORS is? OK. Many of you didn't answer. Are you asleep? Who is asleep? No one? OK, good. Everyone's awake. That's good. So a CORS header, CORS is a system by which origins can say, this other origin should have access to my data. So you can say that example.com should be able to read the content of this origin, even though it's not part of example.com. So it's an extension to the same origin policy, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So the idea of sub-resource integrity, the things that it opens up, and in particular content addressable caching, we need to be really careful about. We need to be really careful about the ways that we enable such a cache if we do, in fact, end up building one. And in the spec, we've talked about a couple of ways in which we could reduce the likelihood that they could be used for bad purposes. And it generally boils down to saying, if this resource can be cached, publicly cached by a shared cache, that is, if it has a set of headers that HTTP BIS defines as being publicly cacheable, then it's probably OK to cache it. It's something that's public, so we shouldn't have any problems if people know that you've been to it or that you've downloaded it from a shared source. We're looking at a couple of things beyond the content addressable cache that might or might not be enabled by sub-resource integrity. For instance, and probably the most heated debate has come with regard to the concept of mixed content. So generally speaking, if I serve a website over HTTPS, both Chrome and Firefox block mixed active content. That is, if I try to load a script over HTTP rather than HTTPS, we'll block that script in HTTPS context because I've encrypted the website, but I haven't encrypted the script, which means we can make no guarantees about the content that's actually being loaded. And in fact, we are losing some of the guarantees that the lockup in the corner is actually making. So you no longer have privacy, for instance, because this is going over an HTTP connection as opposed to HTTPS. If, however, we embed the integrity metadata in the actual document, so we send the entire document over HTTPS, and we embed this integrity metadata, then we start being able to make some guarantees about whatever resources I'm loading, even if I'm loading those resources over HTTP. So if example.com over HTTPS sends a request for cdn.example.net.script.js with integrity metadata, that integrity metadata was protected when the page was shipped, right? So it's part of the encrypted packet, which means I can make the guarantees about that integrity metadata that I couldn't make about the file itself. But if I load the file and it matches the integrity metadata, then maybe I don't have to warn the user anymore. Maybe that matches what the author's intent was, and at that point, I don't have to block that execution. There is heated debate about whether or not this is a good idea. Generally speaking, the security properties are reasonable. I get the same protections from a security perspective that I would get if both the file and the request were served over HTTPS. I'm sorry, both the page and the sub-resource were served over HTTPS. But I start losing some aspects of what makes HTTPS interesting. For example, I no longer have privacy along with the request, because generally HTTPS means you know that I'm connecting to a server, but you don't know what I'm requesting on that server. If the requests are being made over HTTP, however, then we start losing some of those guarantees, and we start weakening what it means when we display a secure icon in the browser for users. So there's a lot of question about whether or not that's a good idea, both because it starts weakening the guarantees that we make, and also because it might make it less likely that people migrate to HTTPS. So if they have mechanisms by which they can serve things over HTTP and continue doing so, perhaps for performance reasons, then potentially they would stop looking at HTTPS for all of their servers and just look at HTTPS for the main server that's actually serving the page resources. A lot of people, especially on the Chrome security team, do not think that's a good idea at all. So we're having interesting and long discussions about whether or not that's a reasonable thing to do. If you're interested in participating in those interesting and long discussions, the Web Application Security Group, working group at the W3C is a great place to hop in, as well as the Blink Dev mailing list, where I am arguing with people on a regular basis. The very last thing that I'd like to talk about is content security policy, and in particular, its use to mitigate content injection attacks. As I said at the beginning, the browser will very happily load absolutely any resource that you tell it to load. And it'll load it within the context of the page that requests that resource. This is problematic. It's problematic because of the idea of the same origin policy. So an origin is a scheme, a host, and a port. So HTTP example.com 80, or HTTPS google.com 443. Everything within the context of that origin has access to everything in that origin. So any script executing on google.com has access to everything on google.com and is indistinguishable from the application script itself. What's the difference between these two scripts? Anyone tell me? Exactly. There's no difference at all. They're exactly the same as far as the browser is concerned. The browser looks at them both, says, hey, JavaScript, I love JavaScript. JavaScript is awesome, and then executes them as fast as it possibly can. Visually, we can look at them both and say, the first one is awesome. I totally want to execute that script. The second one, I am not sure why that's on my page. I did not write be evil or do evil. I think that's bad. I don't want to be evil. Content injection attacks, of course, would allow this sort of script to be injected maliciously onto your page. It would trick your server, perhaps, into writing out script that the server didn't actually intend to write out. So if you say that your name is open script tag be evil close script tag, and the website doesn't do a good job of escaping content before it actually writes it out to the page, then it's quite possible to inject script. And as we've seen on the web, it's really kind of trivial to find XSS holes in a wide variety of websites. Google has XSS holes. Everybody has XSS holes. Content, there are a variety of contexts on a web page, and this is a fairly exhaustive list of them. You have text in a style tag, text just inside of a p tag, text inside of an attribute of an HTML element. You have text inside of script, and you have text inside of a comment. And the rules for each of these contexts, the parsing rules, are different. For example, in a comment, if you have 2 dashes, that actually closes the comment. And everything after those 2 dashes is parsed as HTML. 2 dashes inside of a p tag has no effect, right? It just writes out 2 dashes to the page. You have to be very, very careful when you're escaping content that you know which context you're writing that content into and escape the content correctly for that context. This is a trivial problem. The rules are very easy. They're all written down. All you have to do is do it correctly. What Alex Russell says beautifully is, I discount the probability of perfection. It's really, really difficult to be perfect. And what we've seen is that we are incredibly bad at being perfect. We are, in fact, incredibly imperfect. And we see our imperfections pop up more and more every day. What I would say is that we're all idiots with deadlines. We generally are not thinking about security. We're generally thinking about getting this page out the door, getting this feature out the door, because your manager's standing over you saying, oh, we need this thing, right? And you have a deadline, and you want to get this done. And you kind of know that you're cutting corners, but it's OK because somebody else is going to catch it later. And the code reviewer will actually look at it and make sure that everything's fine, which doesn't happen. Content security policy is a mechanism that allows us to mitigate these risks. It doesn't solve these problems. You still have to do escaping. You still have to be careful about content. But content security policy allows us to mitigate the impacts that could happen if content is maliciously injected into your page. So I'd highly recommend that I guess you write this down. Normally, I would tell people type this into your browser, tweet it immediately. But generally speaking, I hope it's easy enough to remember. It's just a couple of characters. This is a pretty good article written by a very, very handsome man indeed. And it gives you the basics that you need in order to understand content security policy. I'm going to talk about it for another 10 minutes or so, but this is going to give you the detail that you would need in order to actually start playing with it on a website. Content security policy will generate errors kind of like this. The idea is that the policy is delivered via an HTTP header and defines the set of resources that a website can load, either via their origin or via their URL. And if resources are loaded that don't match this policy, then the browser will reject them. It will say, hey, you've tried to load evil.js. That is not part of this content security policy directive, so I'm not going to load it for you. Something has gone wrong. Perhaps you should look into that. This is the content security policy for a very, very high-value website, mikewest.org. You may have heard of it. You may have visited it earlier. And I hope that it's relatively straightforward to understand. We start by setting a default source of none, which means don't load resources. Only use the website itself and load nothing else. Then we slowly open that up. And we start saying, OK, don't load anything except style from this particular CDN. Or, OK, you can also have some frames from these 2 sources. You can have a little bit of script. You can have images from your own origin and from a couple of others. And you can have some web fonts, but nothing else. What this allows you to do is, in a very granular manner, open up particular resources for particular pages. Each page in your application can have a separate policy crafted and tuned for that page in order to allow only those resources to load that are on that page and that should be on that page, and not to allow resources to load that are potentially injected by a malicious third party. This is an exhaustive list of the directives that are in Content Security Policy 1.0. There are some new directives in 1.1, and we'll talk about 1 or 2 of those in just a moment. But this allows you to control scripts. Object contains things like plugins, Flash, style, images. Media includes audio and video, as well as track elements. Frames, fonts, connections, so things like XHR or event source. Sandbox is a bit special. And then report URI is one that we need to talk about. Report URI allows you to get an understanding of how your website is behaving in the world. Not on your computer, but on your users' computers. So if things are being injected into your website, if potentially you're under attack, or a third party is sitting between you and your users and manipulating the page, as happens a lot with mobile websites and mobile operators, then you can set things up such that you can start getting posts back to your server that say, hey, your users are trying to load this resource, and they're trying to load it on this page. You might want to look at this and determine whether or not you're doing something or not doing something that enables attackers to try to inject resources into this page. You can also set things up as report only, which gives you a nice mechanism for starting to slowly roll out a policy onto a larger website. So you can start with report only, which says a relatively easy policy of just HTTPS, so only load secure resources or only load encrypted resources. And then you can set up an endpoint that starts getting these post responses. So you can start finding the places on your site where you aren't loading resources over HTTPS. And you start getting posts that are just JSON blobs, as you would see below. It tells you the document on which the error occurred, the referrer for that document, blocked URL, et cetera. You guys can read. I'm not going to waste your time. We start running into problems with this stuff, though. So who can tell me what origin does handle click run in? What origin does that come from? Yeah, we don't know either. So we made up an origin, because this is actually part of the page. Self is my origin, so things coming from example.com. But the things that are actually in the page itself aren't part of that origin. They're part of the page. So we have an unsafe inline origin that allows you to say, OK, if you really want to run inline script, then you can whitelist unsafe inline. We call it unsafe inline because it's unsafe, and we kind of don't want you to use it. Also, the event handlers, those are in the same origin. So you have to have unsafe inline in order to have inline event handlers. Now, as anyone knows who has written HTML in the last 5 or 10 years, you shouldn't actually write that first code in the first place. You should instead externalize those scripts and put them into separate resources along with the handler, so that you have some JavaScript that initializes your page, sets up event listeners, and then does everything via this external script. So the external script can be easily validated against CSP, against your content security policy. The inline scripts are where the real problem is. And this is probably the biggest problem that people see with content injection attacks, is just the injection of inline scripts that we don't have control over. So by default, content security policy, if you set a script source, will block inline script entirely. And we've seen this as being the biggest stumbling block for people actually to start using content security policy. Lots of large websites, Google, Twitter, a wide variety of websites, have a lot of inline script. Not because they think it's awesome, but just because somebody wrote it at some point, and they thought it was a good idea. So it's on the web page. And getting rid of it is proving to be problematic. It's proving to be more difficult than we would like. So we need to give people a mechanism by which they can start rolling out content security policy while keeping those inline scripts that they actually intend to have on their page. So we've come up with 2 mechanisms in 1.1 that we think are going to be useful for this use case. Firefox has just rolled out both of these in their current nightlies, and they should both be in Chrome 36, which will be coming out in about 12 weeks. You can start playing around with them today in Canary and probably Dev Channel as well. So the first of these mechanisms is called a nonce, a number used once. The idea is that you serve a nonce in your content security policy, and you just have a long random string. This random string should be different for every page load. So every person should get a different nonce every time they refresh the page. And you set things up such that you include the nonce in your header, and you include the nonce on the page along with every script tag that should execute, that you have inserted into your page. The browser can very quickly compare these two and determine, OK, this script is good. The user has said that I should execute this script, and that I should not execute this other script. So it gives you a mechanism of explicitly whitelisting individual inline scripts, which we think is going to allow larger websites in order, to start using content security policy, which we're really quite happy about. The second is a hash. So the nonce has some interesting properties. Basically, any script on your page that has this nonce will execute. And it's transferable. So if I give somebody else the nonce, because I load an ad, for instance, then I can give that nonce to the ad provider, which gives them the ability to execute script on my page. It's kind of like a capability in a capability system. So the nonces have some really interesting properties, especially when you need to include third-party script. Hashes have very interesting properties when you don't need to include third-party script and when you only want to whitelist 1 or 2 specific scripts on your page. So the hash basically says, take all the content of the script tag, hash it, and then compare it up to the content security policy. If it matches, execute. If it doesn't match, don't. This gives you some good protections, because you can say, only this script will execute on my page, and no other script will execute on my page. It's not transferable, because it means only this particular script. And it's a little bit more difficult to use, because anytime you change anything on your page, you have to rehash and then make sure that your content security policy is up to date. But for certain use cases, either the nonce or the hash might make more sense. So we're including both in 1.1, and we're shipping both. And we're interested in seeing how that's actually going to work in the wild. The very last thing I'll talk about is framing. So if you see a website like this that someone has sent you to, and you really want to click on this thing because it's happy, and if you click on it, it might be even happier. Wouldn't that be great? The canonical clickjacking attack is like-jacking. So someone has framed Facebook, their little like button, and they really want you to click on this, but they don't want you to know that you're clicking on it. So they make an invisible iframe, then you click on the iframe, and you think you've clicked on this happy thing, but in fact, you've just liked somebody's website. There are, of course, more interesting things that you can do with clickjacking. Mario and Freddie have put together a really great paper, actually, that I think is worth your time to read, called X-Frame Options, all about clickjacking. I'm not going to talk about all the things that they talk about, because they do a better job of it than I would do here. So again, write it down. I don't know. You can look at the slides afterwards. X-Frame Options is a header that allows you to determine whether or not your site can be framed. So banking websites, perhaps, don't want to be framed at all. Maybe Facebook doesn't want to be framed at all, or at least certain pages of Facebook, like the login page in particular. In those cases, you can send X-Frame Options deny or X-Frame Options same origin, which says, OK, my origin can frame me, but no one else can frame me. These are relatively, they're not very granular. In fact, there are options in other browsers. I say other browsers. I work on Chrome. That is the browser. And then there are other browsers. And these other browsers have other options. So both Firefox and IE supports the ability to whitelist specific origins to say that example.com can frame me, but others can't. We've held off on doing this because we actually think that this should be part of content security policy. And in fact, now it is. Haha. Both in Firefox currently and in Chrome 36, which again will be coming out in a couple of weeks, there's a frame ancestors directive, which allows you to, with exactly as much granularity as any other content security policy, determine what pages can frame a particular page. And in fact, you can say that a particular page can frame this page, or a particular origin, whatever. So this gives you the ability to determine who can frame you. And it's actually very important for you to make that determination. If your page shouldn't be framed, if you don't have a use case for framing your page, set frame ancestors of none and ensure that no one can frame your page. That should be the safe default. But we're in a world where anyone can frame you, so you have to actually opt into that world. And I highly recommend that you do so. So with that in mind, HTTPS everywhere. Very, very important. If you don't have encryption, you have nothing. Second, if you have an application, deploy content security policy. I think it's really important, and I think it's probably the best mitigating factor that we have currently for you to protect yourself against content injection attacks. Third, follow the progress of sub-resource integrity. It's very early days. There's a lot of discussion still. We do not have an implementation yet in any browser. I'm working on an implementation for Chrome, but it's going to take some time. But follow the progress, because I think it's going to be interesting going forward. And finally, you should ask questions. You should either ask questions right now, or you should come to the not marketing event later, the event where there are apparently grain-based beverages that we should all partake in. And feel free to ask me questions there as well. Or you can find me again on Twitter. That's the easiest and safest way to talk with me, because I might actually respond to you. So thank you very much for your time.